Andy, you joined John and Linda in 1978 at Ravensdown. John and Linda look back at the many house sharing episodes, Ravensdown, Newton Aycliffe, Whittingham, and the many Easter workshop as an apprenticeship to community. Can you tell us what important lessons were learnt then and how they became the foundation for the Northumbria community?
Yes, I didn't ever intend to live in Berwick. I just contacted your mum and dad to say could I come and stay with them for a few days while I sorted out my accommodation back on Holy Island. And your dad says that God said to him when he said, "Oh no, not visitors already," he said, "Oh, he's not coming to be a visitor, he's coming to be part of your family, he's going to be living with you, but be gentle with him because he doesn't know that he's going to be staying longer than he thinks." So I came and stayed, and at that point we were very excited because we'd each had the word community, we'd each had Isaiah 58, we'd each had the sense, I think, of the place and of the land and North Northumberland, and investing in that in some special way, and that somehow the history of the place then had things to teach us now that weren't about replicating the past, but somehow learning from the past the things that were relevant for now. And we were open and interested as to what community might mean. And I suppose the three of us living in one big house, it was helpful that it was big, was beginnings of lessons about adjusting to other people, and that just because you call to something doesn't automatically make it easy.
Yeah.
But they were very rich times, and I suppose we used things that I'd learned. I'd just been taught about motivational gifts, and we began to explore that and begin to teach it to other people to help people go deeper in their relationships with each other. We, I think, began to discover that God sent us all kinds of folk. The number of folk who came into the house at Ravensdown, and there was an awful lot of brokenness. And the same was true with the first Easter workshops. There was this sort of mixture between people who everybody else would overlook and other people who were high flyers who were either had already crashed or were in danger of crashing at any moment. There was a kind of brokenness as a kind of common denominator, I think.
We would describe those people as faithful friends. Can you tell us a little bit more about those folk, the Alnwick Prayer Group, the Edinburgh folk, the Vine?
Alnwick. We started a wee prayer group at Alnwick as a spin-off from some seminars. There was Paul Hendy, Douglas Graham, myself, the three of us teaching these seminars, and then we started this little prayer group in Alnwick. And I think it ran 12 years in the end, and some of those folk are still around, and there was always some kids on the floor crawling around drawing. You know, it changed over the years as to who they were, and there was always music that was learnt by heart. There was always teaching, but the teaching was always done with flashcards and things, and some of the folk couldn't read, and they would pass a pair of glasses around ceremonially, and it didn't make any difference. But we would learn everything. But we did loads of stuff with the Alnwick group, and yes, it was like God turned up, and I think that was the key thing. Very, very earthed. I can remember one time having a meeting in a house in Alnwick, and the window had been smashed, and there was somebody having an argument out in the street, and they were louder than what was happening inside the house, and then meanwhile there were some dogs barking and everything, and you just sort of thought that was all part of the Alnwick experience. It was, but very, very loving and very exciting in a way. All those folk. And who else were you saying? The folk from
the Edinburgh folk?
Yes, we had, I think, 40 odd people came down for the second Easter workshop. They cancelled their camp and came down to Wallace Green Hall and just piled out, Kirsten Coulter brought them down, and Rob Fawcett came to teach at that, and they lived just a few miles away from each other, and they hadn't met, and there was some kind of a misunderstanding that got patched up in the kitchen at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and soon we had people all laid out in the kitchen all night, and it's just extraordinary things and stuff where the prayer sort of spilt out into the streets, and kids dancing on the streets and then running around the walls of Berwick and so on. But just very memorable times that people would, I think, have touched people's lives forever.
Holy Island's always played a key part in Easter workshops. Can you recall some of those memories and how they've become a foundational part of the Northumbria community?
Well, the Easter workshops, when we first began, were the only time that people really gathered from all over. It was the one event where people gathered, and they met people from other parts of the country, and sometimes there would be a little flurry of people moving house, relocating another totally different geographical area to be with folk that they'd met at Easter workshops. And there was the sense of, if you weren't at Easter workshop, then you'd missed something, because we started almost like numbering our years from Easter to Easter instead of January to January. And part of that, we would endeavour around Easter to come to the island, and we would go to the priory. We would do stuff that was high praises there. It was part of that thing about keeping the powers of darkness firmly underfoot by once a year at Easter doing some kind of a declaration or celebration there at the priory. We tried to make the Easter workshops travel out of the area as well, so they've been all over the place, and somehow combine the travelling with there still being a delegation coming to the island around Easter time.
Okay, the phrases the Upper Springs and the Nether Springs are metaphors that both you and John and Linda spoke about in the earliest times together. Can you explain their origin and their meaning?
You've got a scripture in Judges and in Joshua which talks about Caleb and his daughter Axa and her husband Othniel. They come into the promised land. Joshua and Caleb have been the two that have survived all the 40 years going round in circles. And they come into the land, they come back into it, and he says, give me this mountain. And so he's given this particular parcel of land, and it's part of that land that he gives to his daughter as a dowry. And she goes to her dad and says, you've given me this dark, barren, desert land. Now also give me some springs so that I can irrigate, so I can water this land. And the father gives her the upper and the nether springs. Now, we felt that that spoke prophetically about North Northumberland, that it seemed a very dark, isolated place. Beautiful as it was, spiritually it seemed really quite dark and quite desert, quite barren. And we were clear that God had said to us, this is the land that I'm giving to you to inherit. But we were saying that's all well and good, but what we need now is springs that can water this place. And what we began to see was that the springs we were being directed to were roots of Celtic monasticism and so on, and they were the things that were going to water the distinctive gifts of this land and bring them back into blossom. And the upper springs, which were the ones that were more open and more easily visible, were what was already there on the island. People came to the island and were immediately touched, and they came looking, and they found something. The question for us, the obsession almost became, where is the place of the nether springs? And the places that we knew where you could touch that were Cuthbert's Cave perhaps, but more especially at the time we would have been aware of Old Bewick, or when we were at Glanton, Whittingham, that was in that same catchment area of a place north of Alnwick, inland a bit. We knew somewhere around there we were looking for a place that could be a mother house, a monastery, a home for the nether springs. And eventually John and Ken were in Ireland, and there was a prophetic word given to them at Clonfert that the place we were to be looking for was to be a place that would be rented, not bought, and it would have its own water supply. It would be close to a cave. It would be by a distinctive bridge, and all of these different things. At that point we soon got a letter offering us Hetton Hall, and of course it fulfilled every one of those criteria except they said about the water supply. They didn't think it would be adequate for the number of people we anticipated coming. And then somewhere in the middle of the work that was done on the property, didn't they stumble upon another spring? So suddenly it literally became a place of Nether Springs, and it was close to Cuthbert's Cave, of course. There's an interesting thing there, because if you were to look at a picture we have of the monks carrying the body of Cuthbert, the first place they went carrying the body was Cuthbert's Cave, and they did that in a day's journey, carrying the body after the Vikings came back. And so we always look at that picture of the monks carrying the body from the island as being the journey from the upper to the Nether Spring.